country ain't nothing but a company's dream. A couple 100 million workers, it's all that they see. Our hands on the tools, money writing the rules. From the sweatshop prisons to the cops in the schools. Got the middle class living like it's gonna last, working longer, harder hours for less and less cash. Got the media spins, Republicrat twins. Got the war profiteer, corporate executive grins. Got the heroin running through the veins of the poor. Got the ghettos locked down, paying blood for the war. Got the cities decay, the dealers to pay, and the death squads working for the CIA.
Hello, this is Socialist Lynx. I wanted to make a video talking about the current questions about the national question, which is why this video is titled "The National Question in the 21st Century." I wanted to make this video because this video is basically a well, it's kind of like a pretty irrelevant video now, but I basically made this script way back when basically the Bad Mouse versus Vaush drama was going on. Or not even drama, but more of like a debate on black nationalism in general. And I basically wanted to basically just address some of that, some basically the things that is basically being said there. So before I do, I kind of want to give some prefaces though, a general preface and then some certain prefaces to basically, specific like national struggles that did occur throughout history on how this can further basically back up some of the points I'm going to basically bring up later in the general introduction and general preface of basically what I'm basically going to be talking about. So basically, if you don't know, the preface of this is that basically there was a debate between someone named Ian that is better known as Vaush. So I'm going to refer him to just Ian Vaush. And another person named Professor Flowers that goes online by Professor Flowers. And there was a debate between them that basically resulted, Ian Vaush strawmanning a lot of stuff that basically Professor Flowers says. For example, Vaush saying that basically Professor Flowers is advocating for white genocide, rather than understand, the international class struggle of like workers, and a bunch of other problems that basically was going on in debate. As well as basically Vaush just completely not understanding how racism itself works. Bad Mouse ended up making his own 2 cents into the situation, and then another person ended up basically making their own 2 cents into the situation against Bad Mouse as well, and same with Ian Vaush also basically making a response against Bad Mouse. The other person that put their 2 cents in the situation siding with Vaush was Demon Mama, that basically made a terrible understanding of basically what Bad Mouse was talking about in going against basically Ian Vaush, and Demon Mama just siding with Ian Vaush on basically the question of black nationalism and whether or not there should be a new Afrikan Republic. At the end of the day, neither of them agreed to basically debate again, especially Bad Mouse making it very clear he does not want to debate Vaush or any person on this topic that claims himself to be a transitionary market socialist or a pragmatic leftist or some form of obscure libertarian socialist. God, even Vaush is basically just calling themselves libertarian socialists is just such a fucking insult to Emiliano Zapata. Like, I'm not even joking. Like, I'm not even a libertarian socialist. I don't even give a shit, honestly. But just, like, if you read the theories of Emiliano Zapata, like, the actual guy that founded Socialismo Libertario, right? Like, Vaush would probably be, like, the least of that, man. Oh, my God. And I guess Vaush calling himself an anarchist would make sense, because he would definitely make Pierre-Joseph Proudhon proud. Anyways, enough of shitting on Vaush. But yeah, no. Vaush sucks, but anyways, that's not the point. The point is that basically the things that basically was brought up in this debate was some of the same problems that basically a lot of people have, and a lot of people just don't really understand when basically looking to these national liberation movements, including people like in these basically specific areas, which I'm going to mention. So to basically make a preface to an Irish edition, I'm going to ask a question to basically further basically incentivize some of the points I'm going to basically bring up here, and why basically some of the things that basically what Vaush pointed out, such as basically trying to bring back, such as rather not where the basically line is drawn on basically having to basically give self-determination for certain people to have their own nation. So, what makes a person Irish? Why not basically have Irish people just call themselves Celtic or Gaelic? The simple answer is because those Celtic and Gaelic tribes that existed within Ireland really no longer exist. They've been either wiped out via conquest or just ended up withering away over time. And that happened during the times of feudalism, where basically their people have been wiped out by foreign invaders from Scandinavia, Britain, and France. That also had taken over and had destroyed some of their own native tribes, and integrate them a part of a different nationality by force. What makes the Irish today as Irish is the fact that basically they're the people from both of those Celtic tribes and all those Celtic tribes that have been wiped out by the British eventually and have been forced to basically live in British domain and a British dominion for a long time under feudalism, even to capitalism as well. To this day, the Irish in Ireland is still majorly dependent, dependent, and is also resolving to Britain itself, and does not actually have a lot of independence from Britain as much as it basically claims to be. But what makes someone Irish and the nation of Ireland itself is the fact that basically it is a group of people and is a nation that is united on basically on a similar identity and a similar struggle that they had throughout their history, and that they're willing to basically fight for against that form of struggle, and in order to basically liberate themselves from that struggle, in order to basically prosper thoroughly. That's the point of basically calling yourself Irish and basically being being in a nation of Irish people, an Ireland. That's the point. This is the same reason why British people don't call themselves Britannic. Is because those Britannic tribes, they just don't exist. Same with the Gaelic and Celtic tribes in Ireland. They don't exist, but that doesn't matter. The point is that basically these nationalities and these forms of basically how people are able to call themselves that were able to evolve and adapt even further to the point where it meant so much more than basically these tribes, but especially to the Irish, it meant a struggle against Britain, a struggle against basically British occupation, British imperialism and colonialism of their land, that is basically still to this day being fought against. It is the same reason of what would basically even be considered among North America in general as a black person, a person that has their ancestry originate from Africa, but their ancestors were forcefully kidnapped and forcefully brought to this continent to act as slaves, and with no really way to basically get home other than to basically declare their own emancipation and occupy basically the residence that they have. That's the thing that what Haiti did, and what the Louisiana Slave Revolt of 1811 tried to do as well. These people, these movements, were able to basically organize themselves as a way to actually fight against the total terror and the total problems and economic struggle that even white peasants were basically having around this time, and against basically the landlordry as a whole and around. And in Ireland specifically, this was able to happen where people in Ireland, especially the Limerick Soviet, Dublin Soviet, and Cork Soviet, where they were organizing themselves together, not to basically just fight against, not just saying Irish workers unite or the Irish people fight against the British oppression, but workers of the world unite against British militarism. That was the slogan of many Irish working class revolutionaries during the Irish Revolution. Because this form of liberation against Britain coincided with the overall class struggle that the Irish people knew that many British workers are also basically facing, and that and that if they were to unite together, they can be able to actually win each other's interests. For Ireland to basically be independent of Britain and free of exploitation, and the British people free of exploitation from their own population as well, is allowing the proletariat of the imperialist nation and the proletariat of an imperialized nation to work together into basically fighting against a common enemy. That common enemy being the bourgeoisie that basically are in control and have dominance in those nations. That is why even during the Irish Revolution, many working class strikes and many even rebellions were taking place in local areas, siding in solidarity with the Irish Revolution. Many of them not even just organized by Irish people, but native British people. But these British people were working class people that understood some of the struggles that basically these Irish people were facing. And because of that, that is what basically makes an Irish person, and Irish, especially considering the specific context of where Ireland is today and how Ireland as itself came to be, from the dissolution of the Celtic and Gaelic tribes within Ireland, but ended up becoming Ireland and the people that occupy Ireland, the Irish. Now, I kind of want to basically make a preface to a Mexican edition. What makes why for Mexicans to call themselves Mexicans rather than Mexica? It's a simple answer. Same with Ireland. The reason why is because the Mexica tribes just no longer exist. They've been wiped out through conquest, and they've been wiped out through colonialism of their land. And they were forced to basically become, and many of them were basically forced to become slaves, and then even other slaves being brought from Africa to, Mexico, to basically work as slaves, and then to later make them become peasants, in order for them to basically rule under the dominion of Spain, and basically work for basically a Spanish nobility. The Aztecas, the Mayanas, the Zulas, the Navajos, and those tribes and their significance were completely wiped out from Mexico, and many of them were either basically forcefully to basically breed with the Spanish Europeans, to basically make their entire identity somewhat disappear, but also force them to basically have sexual relations with Spanish in order to basically commit to a certain kind of national brotherhood, to basically alienate a lot of the Mexicano pesantes in Mexico, and that's what ended up happening. That's why there's not a lot of people that consider themselves Mexica in Mexico, is because the tribes that exist in the Mexica tribes, they don't exist, but it's just the land of Mexico, Mexicanas, because those people, right, they were able to organize and they were able to basically say who they are because they had the common struggle that they were oppressed by the Spanish, and that they united together as a people that had the common struggle of basically their tribes basically being wiped out, and also being mixed bred with basically their oppressors, and having their heritage basically wiped from them, in order to basically finally rebel against that and basically declare their own independence. That's the same reason what makes Mexico Mexico in a struggle against España, and basically these and basically a lot of these colonial policies. It's the exact same reason why these anti-colonial struggles and these anti-imperialist struggles have a lot of significance to the overall actual fighting against oppression in general. Because these don't speak into these specific areas for a specific national liberation for that specific area. This speaks to the overall international struggle against a specific mode of production existing around that time that was able to rebel. In the case for Mexico, in the first Mexican Revolution, that was feudalism. In the case of the Irish Revolution that led to Irish independence, that was capitalism. That's the point of the new African Republic today, where that's actually attacking capitalism today, especially capitalism within the United States of America, where where black people, especially here in the United States, are still oppressed. They're still facing a lot of discrimination. They're still facing a lot of problems today that is nowhere really somewhat comparable to some oppressions that basically white working class people face. They do face certain oppressions. They're exploited. Both of them are exploited, and both of them are policed. Yes, but black working class people are more policed compared to like white working class people here, and that's just a fact. More black people are less to basically be employed than white people in the United States, and that's a statistical fact as well. Like, these things happen, and these are discrimination that basically black people face within the United States, despite the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act being passed. It still hasn't actually equalized. It's addressed to certain like obvious forms of racism that can occur within the country, but racism can be subtle, and racism has a praxis entirely. As Paul LeBlanc points out in his work talking about black liberation and the American dream, where Paul LeBlanc, where he basically talks about, you know, that there's institutional racism, and this institutional racism can come about in itself direct institutional racism, but also indirect institutional racism. In other words, it could basically be institutional racism that could basically act itself as an actual official law, and is actually limiting people based off like actual state legislation and actual like legislation, judicial action against basically a certain race. But there's also then indirect institutional racism, where this can just basically affect economic coercion in general, and also basically certain basically actions that a nation or economic system can take that can actually negatively affect a certain race compared to another race in general. Because of this is something that is basically rooted in both the mode of production, but also basically the oppressive and the state and the bourgeois state that basically comes about within capitalism, and that's specifically to black people in the United States. That's why this movement for the national liberation of black people in a new African Republic, from Louisiana all the way to South Carolina and maybe in northern Florida, is something that basically is advocated a lot by black people, black revolutionaries such as Malcolm X, Huey P. Newton, Fred Hampton, and even Sheila R. James and George Padmore. Because these are the people that are being oppressed and have been oppressed since they've been forced to basically come to this land in feudalism. And this is why it's basically integral for people to even support, to basically support these movements in general. To abstract it by saying, well, where does the line drawn for basically Native people? For example, in this area where basically black people lived in, this is where basically the Cherokee tribe lived in. But the Cherokee tribe even inhabited that after basically taking over another after another tribe basically inhabited that land. So where's the line drawn for basically self-determination of these certain people? The line is drawn is based off the actual significance, and also based off the actual struggles that basically they face entirely around this point, and on how they basically end up basically facing struggles that is perpetrated by a bourgeois state or by an economic system entirely that is targeting against like an actual race of people. That's where the line is drawn, and like that itself is drawn through just general struggle entirely. So it doesn't really matter if there's people that came before other people. The point is that doesn't matter. It's the fact that basically these people do exist, and they're facing problems right now as we speak, and these problems that they're facing right now as we speak have been going on for a long time. And that these national liberation movements specifically are ways where they can resist against that, and also interlock the international struggle against oppression and exploitation entirely. It's the same reason why the Mexican Revolution, the first Mexican Revolution, the Irish Revolution, was integral, and same with other revolutions that basically led to the independence of nations, as in anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles. Mexico, Haiti, Jamaica, Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Ireland. All these nations have one thing in common, is the fact that basically they were colonialized and imperialized, and they were able to fight against that, and they were able to rebel, and they were able to go against basically their oppressors. That's the same thing in Colombia and Peru and many other different countries that have very similar history when fighting against imperialists and colonialists during feudalism and capitalism. That's why these national liberation movements do indeed have an integral part and integral piece within the actual international class struggle as a whole, both in capitalism but also internationally just in general. Anyways, those are my three prefaces that I basically wanted to basically talk about. Well, actually, I guess four. I mean, no, three. Yeah, those are basically my three prefaces I basically want to make. Anyways, so without further ado, let's actually get to the introduction of basically this piece. And hopefully then we can finally get to the core contents of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to try to break down basically some of the stuff that's basically been going on and like the specific dates and some of my takes on it. That's like a general introduction. And then I'm going to basically talk about the early history of basically racism and the practice of racism specifically in class societies. Or just practice. I'm going to introduce a practice of racism and talk about the early history of basically practice of racism in general. So, yeah. There's been a lot of focus on national liberation movements in the past year or two among the left online, and even ongoing practice in workers' movements around the world. This focus of national liberation movements has thus given a broad range of arguments to support or condemn national liberation movements that has resulted in this factor. But this isn't just happening today. The debate on the support for national liberation movements has been happening for a long time, and a debate known as the national question still continues today. There's been many political tendencies that have supported national liberation movements, saying they can provide an international solidarity revolutionary situation that communists can build up the entire working class from their standing alongside with them in the liberation of a nation's people against the bourgeois imperialist oppressors, in which the proletariat and the imperialist nations can also stand in solidarity with them to build up a workers' movement and support that national liberation movement, thus growing the national liberation movement that provides a form of internationalism under the guise of nationalism. An internationalism through nationalism, to put it bluntly. However, there has been others that deny this will ever happen, and that national liberation movements are reactionary movements that are made up of the petty bourgeoisie to serve capitalist interests. And if they are made up of the proletariat, then they have been diluted by the petty bourgeois reactionary interests that alienate the working class. Thus, the working class must be conditioned to not have their liberation movement only to call for their own national liberation, but just liberation of the proletariat as a class. The first instance of disagreement on the subject in revolutionary communist movements has been first debated by scientific socialists and quote-unquote true socialists, as in the debate being the emergence of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels versus August Willich on the Krakow Revolution of 1848. The most significant instance was Bolshevists and Spartacists, as in the debate between Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg on national liberation movements in general in Europe, West Asia, and North Africa. The most recent popular instance now, which is the base I want to focus on, is the debate between black Marxists and market quote-unquote socialists, as in the debate between Professor Flowers and Badmouse versus Ian Vaush and Demon Mama on black nationalism. As we can see, this debate has been going on for 2 centuries and a half within the leftist movement, with the rise of revolutionary socialism. The reason why is because there's a lot of misunderstanding on this question that is posed, specifically of the ones that are against national liberation movements. Badmouse highlighted this beautifully in Vaush in Vaush and the Haunting Spectre of Baby Leftism by Bad Mouse, where he gave a true Marxist and revolutionary analysis on the debate stream between Professor Flowers and Ian Vaush, debating about black liberation theories developed by the Black Panthers and many black Marxists that talked about the liberation of black people from capitalism that has to be handled by the black people themselves and shouldn't be tainted by white people, proletarian or not, that show not to understand their struggle by trying to integrate the movement for their liberation to be watered down, not for liberation of black people, specifically against the racism they face, and only, and that they can only understand, but to be about class liberation and focus on the class liberation mostly and class struggle mostly, not paying much attention to the race struggle they face as well. The arguments either being malicious or based on a strawman fallacy along the lines of, quote, just because you are white doesn't automatically mean you are racist. There are plenty of black people that are racist towards whites, as well as not every British person is responsible for the massacres of minorities in their colonies. It is true there is racism that is performed quite often against blacks perpetrated by whites, but that does not mean that then the opposite doesn't exist. End quote, Ian Vaush. Black Nationalism, Flowers versus Vaush. This is an actual quote, by the way, if you guys are not wondering. This is an actual quote that Ian Vaush said. I actually just literally wrote down what he said in the debate, like into this basically script. So, yeah. Please help me. I had to watch fucking Vaush to basically make this goddamn video. Worst fucking thing of my life. Worst fucking shit of my life. Even more damning is the act of derailing and going over dumb semantics to try to get a gotcha moment in the debate without actually engaging in a well-rounded and coordinated discussion for a revolutionary movement. Such as Demon Mama and Ian Vaush abstracting the factual evidence that racism against whites around the world is as a discrimination and as well as a cultural level is non-existent today. And yes, you cannot be racist towards whites, unironically, for racism is more than just a prejudice. It has a theory and a practice, and has been acting on and has been acted on with theory since the dawn of slavery around 3000 BCE to the present. Today, in that factor, since the colonialism stage of feudalism, this racism has been acted by white people against black people. There wasn't even a sense of to be called black or white as a person until the transatlantic slave trade that emerged in colonialism specifically. What would be considered as a white person is based off basically rather or not if you owned slaves. To be a black person around this time was simply a rather not if you were the slave. Thus, even by history, white people were not and still are not affected by racism as a praxis. For what defined a person as white was a person enacting the racism to allow accumulation of goods for their benefit as landlords and slaveholders in their interests, through the depravity of peasants and slaves of their freedom, dignity, home, and their interests. Therefore, logically, if we understand racism not as just a prejudice, but as there being a theory of racism and practice of racism that can unify into praxis, we can see racism towards whites is by function not racist. For white people historically are defined as the ones that committed the racism in the colonialism period of feudalism. Now, although whites are more generalized to just people with more European descent, there is still forms of institutional racism, both direct and indirect, that are specifically made to target black people, Asian people, Latinos, Arabs, Indians, and indigenous Americans, made by white politicians and white bourgeois benefactors to benefit mostly white people. especially the bourgeoisie that is considered white, to keep the working class alienated from their interests and even from the camaraderie together, as well as indirectly force more people of color to lower the price of their labor power so they can pay less of a cost of production. But in order to seem as if they are the rational, charismatic content creators to satisfy basically their own ego, they make a straw man fallacy of the argument, just completely derail the actual meaning of the conversation. Basically not even addressing the actual forms of discrimination that black people face, such as the fact that they're lower, such as the fact that basically neighborhoods made up of black people in the United States are more policed than neighborhoods made up of white people. More black people in the United States are less to be employed compared to white people, or black people, are less to be employed compared to white people in the United States specifically. As well as the fact basically talking about on how there's still forms of segregation, neighborhood segregation, that indirectly happens due to the effects of Jim Crow, despite the fact that Jim Crow has been abolished through the Civil Rights Act. So if one were to point out evidence, we demonstrate that shows that racism against whites can't exist. People like Ian Vaush and Demon Mama would say, "Oh, so you're trying to deny racism of people of color against blacks? You can't claim racism only applies to people of color because it downplays the oppression of white people face. We should focus on integrating everyone into the struggle for real progress." In other words, a childish argument that allows for current factors of racism in the status quo to not be addressed and abstracted to be reduced to nothing but the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Class struggle, important as it is something we should emphasize as leftists in general, is not the only form of oppression and alienation that capitalism produces, and how this oppression is another version of the previous forms of oppression from past class societies. What's even worse, you have someone like Demon Mama that will not even address a lot of the arguments and majority of their actual videos responding towards their critics. They'll just basically focus on the aesthetics or the actual rhetoric that their critics are actually making, rather than the actual points and arguments that the critics are making. So there's this specific quote from Demon Mama in Bad Mouth's return from retirement with a bad Vaush critique by Demon Mama. I'm just going to send this fucking quote because it's really fucking stupid. Quote, "I find that Badmouth calling Vaush by his first name very weird. I just know that if someone was calling me by my first name that I didn't know, I would be weirded out." End quote, Demon Mama. Badmouth's returned from retirement with a bad Vaush critique. No, seriously, who literally cares, Demon Mama? That's not the fucking point that, Badmouth's Productions is at all pointing here. What the fuck? Who literally cares? And then when people like Demon Mama do actually address the argument finally, they end up having non sequitur arguments, or they completely miss the point of basically what their opponents are trying to say entirely. Quote, "Now for the actual argument. This is suggesting that minorities can't be racist towards white people. I think that by the fact there exists hate speech from minorities to white people based on their skin color as white people shows that yes, racism can apply to white people too, and minorities can be racist towards whites. We need to stop this debate already and focus on how our struggle in capitalism as workers in capitalism is what unites us completely and integrate our movements completely to have a strong left wing." End quote, Demon Mama. Badmouth returned from retirement with a bad Vaush critique. That title alone is just fucking stupid. I mean, that argument is just missing the fucking point. What the hell? Anyways, now although this is not wrong from a certain idea on racism, this is still wrong on the dialectical formation and action of racism that exists all around the world and plays an important role into the ways oppression is carried out through racism. While yes, there has been instances, and there resumes to be instances where people of color may call white people a cracker, a hick, a honky, a yankee, or whatever. And instances where people of color may make fun of white people, white person's skin color, saying they look like they dump their bodies in mayonnaise as bathing themselves. Yes, it happens, and it is quite vulgar to me, as even a person of color to some degree. However, this ignores the struggle of racism that these groups go through. At least white people are nine out of ten are 9 out of 10 situations less likely to get shot by the police based off their skin color. At least white people are practically guaranteed to not have to be stopped by border patrol, detained, or sent to a concentration camp for days, that are sometimes not given food or water while in captivity just for being suspected as an undocumented immigrant in the country. To the point, by the time they get out, the fat in their bodies are already consumed by the metabolism system in the body, where the person detained is on the verge of experiencing comatose or death. At least white people are 8 out of 10 less likely to be killed by people just for the facial features, skin color, or place of birth. The reality is that you can claim the scare against working class infighting all you want, but just by pointing out that the racial hierarchies of the world are stacked against people of color, this shows racism against white people on that specific metric of racism as historically practiced and still practiced today is only stacked against those people of color. Of course, the class hierarchies still exist as well that affect both white people and people of color. Daniel Shaver was still shot by a SWAT. Daniel Shaver was still shot by a SWAT team with an M16 and died while trying to relax in a hotel room with his girlfriend. A white person in Tucson was still shot by police just for being suspected of holding a knife in a Walmart, where the man was just hungry and was shoplifting because he had no money. The police is indeed still an armed body against the working class itself to preserve capital. Yes, all these things did happen. Yes, white people do indeed get killed by the police. Yes, white neighborhoods do indeed still get policed. Yes, that does happen. And it's actually liberal to say otherwise. But that does not necessarily negate the fact that basically people of color experience more of these things compared to white people. Now, not every argument that is made by leftists that don't support national liberation is the exact same argument. And in fact, many leftists are against national liberation movements and denounce Vaush for this argument that he presented to Flowers. However, they may claim that, while at the same time go on to reduce any form of liberation movement to having to be about class struggle, to having to be about oppression of the proletariat from the bourgeoisie, either only that or being the main focus. Anything that goes against this then is likely to become reactionary and against the working class's interests at hands of trying to alienate them with nationalism. This is quote-unquote nationalism. Thus, regardless of how the argument is said, it's still performing the exact same logic behind the argument. That logic being reductionism. An example of such thing was made by the Internationalist Communist Tendency in their work, Neither Israel Nor Palestine, No War But the Class War by the Internationalist Communist Tendency, where they gave the exact same logic as Vaush and Demon Mama did in their debate with Professor Flowers and Bad Mouse. Quote, to this day, they have to put class before nation. They have to reject the squalid anti-imperialism of the quote-unquote left, the same kind who fortified 40 years ago the herald of the Ayatollahs as anti-imperialists, as a massacred Iranian workers, which is really a one-sided anti-imperialism. exactly 100 years ago, before the foundation of the State of Israel. Karl Marx wrote, "Workers have no country. You cannot take from them what they do not have." The only answer to the Israel-Palestine question is not one state or a two-state solution, but a destruction of all states, where responsibility for the future of the planet is out of the hands of capitalist profiteers. Instead of an exploitive system which leaves a quarter of the world's population not sure where it exists, where its next meal will come from, alongside billionaires who boasted fortunes get bigger with every year that passes. We need a revolution which creates a world based on human need and not capitalist demands. We have a world to win. We cannot do it. We cannot do it, but only if we can politically unite all frontiers. The ICT is dedicated to building such an international and internationalist movement. Our slogan remains, "No war but the class war." End quote. Internationalist communist tendency. Neither Israel nor Palestine. No war but the class war. As if somehow the Israeli state can be anywhere compared to the oppression the Palestinians face, and the need for basically the Palestinians to resist against that Israeli state. Yeah, as if Israeli settlers could basically be comparable to the oppression of Palestinians in Israel. Even though the modern Israeli state has been defined as a state that perpetrates racism by taking away their land, destroying their homes, banning their culture, and forcibly integrating them to be a part of the culture of Israel, forcing them to agree to the particular fascism of Israel that Moshe Shrahat and Chaim Weizmann founded under the name of Zionism, and genociding their population to where the new Israeli ethnic group is violently killing off the Palestinian ethnic group within Palestine. Yeah, as if basically Israelis basically inhabiting another people's land could be anywhere close comparable to that same native people's land literally being genocided against by a fascist state. And it can be comparable because it is true. Palestinian workers and Israeli workers do indeed face exploitation, but that's not specifically on the actual problems of basically what's going on in Palestine. These problems is not even just based off class struggle. It is the struggle of the capitalist mode of production entirely, which includes identity politics and racial struggles and ethnic struggles that's going on within Palestine. What the internationalist communist tendency is not getting is that by telling the Palestinian proletariat that their national liberation movement, their way of life, and their culture that they grew up in as kids is now being forcibly taken away is something that should be put aside. That is something that they should just forget and move on to the ideas of class struggle being more important, which abstracts the total picture of the oppression that the Palestinians face, and saying that the Israelis and the Palestinians should just put aside their differences and focus on the difference from them to their boss and the direct anger at their boss, but ignores the totality that the Palestinians now are defined by their struggle against the fascists that took their land and genocided them to change the name of Palestine to Israel to fit their theological mystification that justifies their form of Zionism. Now, this doesn't mean that then the Palestinians can't unite with the Jewish oppressed proletariat as well in Palestine. In fact, this is something that has historically happened and still happens today. But it can't be done in a way where it just downplays their struggle for autonomy. That is, autonomy is the only way where they can truly be free from the clutches of imperialist and fascist takeover of Palestine. We must have the working class of the world unite, yes. Working men have no country, yes. The emancipation of the proletariat is what will emancipate the rest of the world, yes. We must abolish classes, money, and the state, which will create socialism and communism where humanity entirely can be free, yes. But that can't happen if we don't build up the proletariat in their movements they themselves control for us to spread class political consciousness that will ultimately allow the vanguard party to be realized through struggle and thus centralize the proletariat in the vanguard so the proletariat internationally in their own self-action emancipate themselves. Thus, the need to allow these national liberation movements that are controlled by the proletariat, to allow these national liberation movements that are controlled by the proletariat to flourish, that call for autonomy in their nationalistic politics, should be supported to bring about internationalist praxis. This is something that even Karl Marx talked about around the exact same time the slogans of workers have no country emerged in the Communist League. This was made when Karl Marx analyzed the Krakow Revolution of 1848. That was a workers' revolution with a mildly strong communist presence, spreading class and political consciousness that grew out of a revolutionary situation that emerged from a national liberation movement, calling for the liberation of Poland and the Polish people from Prussian and Russian occupation and militarism. That was calling for workers in Prussia and peasants and workers in Prussia and peasants in Russia to unite together and fight a common enemy, that being the bourgeoisie and landlordry of Prussia and Russia, that enhanced the class struggle that was already in full swing in Prussia and the German Confederation entirely, and even forced Russia to change their economics slightly to allow commodity exchange to be a main driving force of their economy, and also allow more equality between Poles and Slavs to emerge. Even so far, this resonated with Polish Americans and just Americans in general in New York were facing similar problems with the bourgeois class in America, which led to strikes and more brotherhood between Poles, Irish, Black people, Asian Americans, German Americans and Germans, French, and Indigenous Americans all around the world. Quote, but what did the communism of the Krakow Revolution consist of? Was it communist because it wanted to restore the Polish nationality? One could as well say that the war which European coalition waged against Napoleon was communistic, and that the Congress of Vienna 1815 was made up of the crowded communists. Or was the Krakow Revolution communist because it wanted to install a democratic government? Nobody would accuse the millions of citizens and Bern and New York of communistic impulses. Communism denies the necessity of the existence of classes. It wants to abolish all classes and all class distinctions. The Krakow Revolution wanted to extirpate only the political distinctions among classes. It wanted to give equal rights to all classes. End quote. Karl Marx. Communism, Revolution, and Free Poland. As we can see, Karl Marx himself is saying this. In fact, my arguments that I provide, I'm getting from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels on their multiple works on Poland, Ireland, Mexico, Native American tribes, India, and China that called for national liberation of these people and their nations, so that way they may grow internationalism. Because Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, although did put an emphasis on class struggle and did show on how class struggle did influence other kinds of oppression as well, even so far to have political class infighting among the proletariat, they were by far not class reductionists, and they saw that there was a contradiction of the struggle for autonomy compared to class struggle, and saw how it worked independently and even in an opposite, but would unify together. Nevertheless, still being different and still being the result of one root thing, not class struggle, but the capitalist mode of production. This is something that the British section of the internationalist communist tendency Communist Workers' Organization, straight up just rejected, completely revising what Karl Marx actually stood for in his books on the national question. As seen from this quote, contrary to popular opinion, Marx and Engels never lent their support to all struggles for national independence. In fact, they outright opposed some, like the national aspirations of the various Balkan states, which they saw as playing right into the hands of the Russian Empire. For them, it was a tactical question, in which national movements could provide favorable conditions for the development of workers' movements in the near future. And here, Marx and Engels singled out Poland because, situated in the center of the continent, the mains of its partition was the very tie which binds the Holy Alliance of Russia, Austria, and Prussia together. And Ireland, because English reaction in England had its roots subjugation of Ireland. In the First International, Marx and Engels defended their views on Poland against the idealist followers of Proudhon, and on Ireland among the conservative English trade unionists. End quote. Communist Workers' Organization, Nationalism and Internationalism. As we have shown from our extractions of what Karl Marx talked about the Polish national liberation movement, it was the exact opposite. Karl Marx supported Polish national liberation movements because of the fact by standing in solidarity with them, it allows more internationalist practices to emerge from a movement that could be spontaneously founded as a revolutionary situation. This is why the Party of the Proletariat may be able to take advantage of the revolutionary situation by enhancing the class struggle in favor of the proletariat through spreading class and political consciousness. This is why Karl Marx ended up supporting the Polish National Liberation Movement and Irish National Liberation Movement as well. We can even bring Friedrich Engels into this discussion because he holds the same view as Karl Marx on this same debate. Quote, at the time, Minister Hoym, who for 20 years had administered the province of Silesia, quite free from the supervision and used that power for most junker-like swindling and extortions, was entrusted with the administration of South Prussia, as well in reward to the service to God, king, and country. In the interest of splendor and might of the dynasty, in order to create a splendid and mighty class to devoted junkers from the backwoods, Hoym proposed to his lord and master that he should bestow as many as possible to the confiscated church and crown lands of so-called deserving persons. That was done. A host of rascally knights, favorites of royal mistresses, creatures of the ministers, accomplices whom one wanted to silence, were presented to the largest and richest estates, plundered country, and thereby German interests, predominantly German land ownership, were implanted among the Poles. In order not to arouse royal cupidity, Hoym had as a precaution assessed these estates for the king at a quarter or sixth part of their value, and something even less. He was afraid, and probably not without reason, that the king were to learn the true value of these estates, he would think in his own paternal pocket before anything else. During Hoym's 4 years of administration after the pacification from 1794 to 1798, there were in this manner given away the Posen administrative region 22 in Kalisz, formerly Piotrkow, formerly the Piotrkow region of 19. In Warsaw Region 11, altogether, 52 larger and smaller groups of estates, which in total contained not less than 241 separate estates. The king was told that the value of the estates was 3.5 million thalers. their true value exceed 20 million thalers. The Poles will know from whom during the coming revolution they will have to extract these 20 million thalers at the Polish millard stolen from them by the right of traffic in people. In Kilitsch, in the Kilitsch region alone, the area of the estates given away amounted to more than a third of all crown and church lands, and income from the estates, even according to the miserable estimates of value of the grants of 1799 alone, was 247,000 thalers annually. End quote. Frederick Engels, Posen. Frederick Engels also thus saw the dialectic of national liberation movements and the role it plays actually into having the internationalist praxis. He even went so far to even talk about other nations that were having their own national liberation movements in the German Confederation at the time, like Saxony and Rhineland. Quote, the consequence of this industry, which is also burgeoned under the revolutionary rule of the French, and the trade connected with its creation of the Rhenish Prussia, of a mighty industrial commercial big bourgeoisie, and opposition to it of a large industrial proletariat, two classes in which the rest of Germany only existed in isolated areas as the embryonic form of which almost exclusively dominated the distinct political development of the Rhineland province. Over the rest of the German states revolutionized by the French Rhenish Prussia has the advantage of industry over the rest of the German industrial areas, Saxony, Silesia. The advantage of the French Revolution is the only part of Germany whose social development has almost reached to the level of the modern bourgeois society, developed industry, extensive trade, accumulation of capital, and free ownership of land. The predominance in the towns of a strong bourgeoisie and the numerous proletariat in the countryside of the multitude of debt-ridden peasants. Rule of the bourgeoisie over the proletariat by means of the wage system, over the peasantry by the means of the mortgage, and over the petty bourgeoisie by the means of competition, and finally the sanctioning of the bourgeois rule through the courts of trade and the factory courts of the bourgeois jury and the entire body of material legislation. It is easier now to understand that the Rhinelanders' hatred for everything that is Prussian. Along with the Rhine province Prussia, incorporated with the French Revolution into its states, treated Rhinelanders not only as a subjected alien people, but even as vanquished rebels. Far from developing the Rhenish legislation, the spirit of ever-growing modern bourgeois society, Prussia intended saddling the Rhinelanders of the pedantic feudal Philistine hodgepodge of Prussia law, which was barely suitable any longer, even for Father Pomerania. Sorry. The revolutionary change after February 1848 clearly showed the exceptional position of the Rhine province. It provided not only the Prussian, but the whole of the German bourgeoisie with a classical representative of the Kampfhausen and Hausemann, and provided the German proletariat of the sole organ in which he championed not only in terms of fine words or goodwill, but according to the true interests and the now Reichszeitung. How is it then that the Rhenish Prussia, for all it took so little part in the Germany revolutionaries movement? Germany's revolutionary movements. It must not be forgotten that the 1830 movement in favor of the hollow Pettifogger constitutionalism cannot hope to interest Germany's Rhenish bourgeoisie, who were busily engaged in much more real industrial enterprise. That whereas the whereas people in the petty German states were still dreaming of a German empire in Rhenish Prussia. The proletariat was already beginning to come, but openly against the bourgeoisie, that from 1840 to 1847, at the time of the bourgeois truly constitutional movement, the Rhenish bourgeoisie stood into the forefront of decisively tipped into the balance in Berlin in March of 1848. The reason, however, why Rhenish Prussia could never achieve anything, an open insurrection, or even bring about a general insurrection of the whole province, is best explained in the straightforward account of the campaign for the imperial constitution of Rhineland. End quote. Friedrich Engels. The campaign for the German imperial constitution. This is something that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were able to do for they saw it as a dialectic. As well did Vladimir Lenin after doing deep reading into G.W.F. Hegel and Ludwig Feuerbach and translating works from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels into Russian and having the Bolsheviks distribute the works. This is very important. But it's not just leftists with egos online and undialectical and self-assertive communist revolutionaries in a different organization than I. This is also a trend to be followed by undialectical and self-assertive communist revolutionaries in the same organization as me. The International Socialist Tendency, I have already addressed, a book made by an Australian comrade of the International Socialist Tendency in a previous work. That book being The Failure of Identity Politics, a Marxist analysis of Marxist analysis by Sarah Garnham. The problem of the work having an ensued dichotomy between intersectionality and class analysis, even though Kimberly Crenshaw in her theories used class analysis as a way to show the oppression of women in society and saw the mode of production as a root problem. Moreover, as we already pointed out, again, Ian Vaush, Demon Mama, and the Internationalist Communist Tendency, it's reducing oppression to be just a class basis and not more. But there's also been another person, someone more important by far and prominent on the fact that holds this position despite his history, Tony Cliff's son, Donnie Glungstein. It is quite well known in the International Socialist Tendency that Donnie Glungstein does hold some ultra-left takes, and he is quite upfront about it. Because of that, his own father, Tony Cliff, and him would get into disagreements before Tony Cliff died in 2000. In his article, Scottish Independence, Prospects for Breaking Up the British State by Donnie Glungstein, he argues some of the similar positions of the internationalist communist tendency and historically people that identify themselves as left communists based on the left-wing factions of the Communist International. That national liberation movement is reactionary, and even if workers are part of it, they are susceptible to reactionary politics, and also doesn't bring about required internationalism into the movement for liberalism of the working class carried into liberate humanity entirely. Except he does it with a bit more understanding than the Communist Workers' Organization. Quote, there are three potential scenarios in light of these results. One is the request of indirect 2 is met by the British government. A majority vote yes. A peaceful transition occurs and two bourgeois states live happily ever after in the Blessed Isle. A breakup of the state, such terms is worthwhile only in symbolic value. Such an outcome is doubtful because both of the Labour and Tories oppose it and inconvincible. In Scotland itself, SNP's neoliberal heart would eventually show. It has no organic link to the working class and as it exists with labor, be it the trade union bureaucracy or conventional bourgeois party. Under SNP rule, council services are starved of cash, and trends towards poverty and inequality are only marginally different in England. Its leadership in the social democratic rhetoric of the marginally progressive policies for electoral reasons than due to the actual ideological commitments. To establish Scotland's credentials on the world stage, the SNP would join other other states in the race on the bottom over the living standards of the public investment. Its suitable growth commission report charts the post-independence economic course pounded up to the austerity. Setting up a branch office for global business is different opening a battlefront against the effects of capitalism on ordinary people's lives. A more likely scenario is indirect too is ruled out by the British government. The S&P will then have to consider what happened in Catalonia. There, in 2017, the Spanish state prevented independence and arrested politicians for daring to hold a referendum without Madrid's permission. The refusal of a new referendum leaves supporters of a Scottish breakaway facing a dilemma. Originating from the character of the call of independence is a bourgeois democratic demand that is shared by both sections of capital and of the working class, but for opposing reasons. It is bourgeois in character because the former wanted an independence to advance the interests of the Scottish capital. However, at the same time, workers see it as a democratic measure that would allow them to gain more control over their lives, so that way they can advance their interests, which run counter in the interests of the Scottish capital and capital more generally. Independence is also bourgeois democratic in another sense. The democracy envisaged remains in the framework of the existing social relations, parliamentarism under the capitalist system. The coalition behind this shared goal makes it politically powerful but brittle. Catalonia demonstrated that an established state may not necessarily relinquish its unity. Being numerically tiny, nationalist Scottish capitalists cannot hope to overcome the grip of the British state without calling upon mass working class support, but insofar as this support is mobilized, it may unleash a threat to or put obstacles in a way of capital accumulation. The way this contradiction works itself out was demonstrated in 2014. End quote. Donnie Gluckstein, Scottish Independence: Prospects for Breaking Up the British State. Here we can see Donnie Gluckstein making the same argument as Communist Workers' Organization in Britain. That being, since many investors and also bourgeois folk in Britain would benefit more with secession of Scotland from Britain to accumulate more profit and guarantee that stocks that have been invested by banks and stockbrokers would go to those investors and sharing the profit accumulation out of the accumulation of capital, means that the Scottish National Liberation Movement is in reality acting the same trap for the bourgeoisie and the proletariat must unite under a new movement under the terms of a predominantly communist program made by, well, the organization they organize, obviously to the organization they affiliate with. So much so, he argues the movement in the end is something the Social Workers' Party shouldn't focus on as much as it is now. As Donnie Gluckstein said, quote, the Radical Independence Campaign, which in 2014 involved members of the Scottish Socialist Party, the Social Workers' Party, and many thousands more left-wing activists, dissolved itself in January 2021. However, bodies such as the Yes Alliance, which links Yes groups from the referendum campaign together, and trade unionists for independence continue to exist outside of former SNP structures. They are all under one banner movement. Has repeatedly channeled growing frustration over the lack of progress, staging huge marches in cities across Scotland in order to demand something more than talk. Its supporters have been open to anti-racism and progressive ideas. The magnificent street confrontation that halted a Dawn immigration raid in Glasgow in May this year symbolized the mood. At the end of 2020, the Now Scotland organization which includes Socialist Workers' Party members in its leadership, was formed to fight an active and radical approach to independence. Despite making further electoral advances, SNP has been splitting partially because of the urgency and desire for indirect 2 outstrips its snail's pace approach. Some members have withdrawn into Yes Group activities or created various small parties. One of these is Salman's Alba Party, though it has failed to get anyone elected. The very fact it splits from one monolithic body shows the tensions. The bitter row between Salman and Sturgeon indicate a malleus that is not reducible to Salman's behavior towards women. It also relayed the vilification over indirect 2. Unquote. Donnie Glugstein. Scottish independence. Prospects for the breaking up of the British state. The problem is that this is literally just trying to abstract a few wealthy individuals that is able to make up the most attention in the mainstream media of Britain as an equivalent to the Scots that are actively evicted from their homes to leave more room for wealthy British families to live in the land that they rent from. Fired from their job based off ethnicity of being Scot, and thus being riled up and protesting in the streets for justice in the end of English bureaucratic substitutionism over Scots, violence perpetrated by orders of officers in the police towards Scots, and being more likely to be unemployed than the English as well with just England removing the significance of the popular opinions of Scots to very important legislative decisions of the country. This is something that anyone in the United Kingdoms of Britain can understand and resonate with. Thus, by supporting the Scottish National Liberation Movement, it is allowing for workers of England, Ireland, Wales to stand in solidarity with them for the fact they go through a common struggle with the same bourgeoisie of Britain and bureaucratic hellhole that is the British bourgeois state. As well, these experiences in Britain is something already many Arabs in France are addressing and standing against France for their own rights and plausible autonomy to be recognized. And both of these Arabs and Europeans in Corsica and Brittany are standing in similar solidarity. That posters have even came up of the workers citing the struggle of the marginalized of Britain and their struggle for autonomy and right to be free from domination. To put it in the words of Chris Harman, quote, so long as the workers in the oppressed nation could see no one defending their right to national equality among the people of the oppressing nation, they would fall for the nationalist dichotomy, demagogy of their own bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie. But if they found the Workers' Party in the oppressing nation standing full square for the right to self-determination, they would see it as a standing for their interests and turn their back on their own bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie. End quote. Chris Harman, The Return of the National Question. From this, Chris Harman would then later to go on say, quote, at each stage, those who have striven to share their gains and the advance rather they themselves have been capitalists, state bureaucrats, or members of the illiterate middle class, have wanted a local national state of their own. The fact that in order to gain such a state, they have sometimes had to bend the definition of a national almost beyond belief and is irrelevant, as is the failure of many of the new states deliver of the economic gains expected from them. The system of nation-states then is the political correlate of the full-blown capitalist mode of production. It is the political form of which, having aided capitalism in its conquest of the world in its youth, persists into the maturity and old age. The strength of the ideology of nationalism under capitalism is not then surprising. It is a part of the reflection of the people's consciousness and the experience of living in a capitalist world. Just living as under capitalism makes the great mass of people take up for granted that commodity production, alienated wage labor, and competition are more common than cooperation. So it makes them take for granted the necessity of the nation state. A nationalist consciousness makes sense so long as they do not challenge the system as a whole. Within the individual the individual capitalist is in a very weak situation unless he has a state to enforce his interests on others. The individual peasant family hopes the state will protect it against the inevitable ups and downs of the market and foodstuffs. The individual worker knows he or she has to belong to a state to be allowed to work and live freely, to apply for welfare benefits when necessary. Marx made the point nearly 150 years ago that the ruling class are always the ideas of the ruling class, and that the ruling ideas are always the ideas of the ruling class. And one of those ideas is the idea that the nation as a natural unit for grouping together a section of humanity into its own cordoned off part of the planet. The ruling ideas are not immuable on this, at least. Hobsbawm is absolutely right. Great social crisis creates situations in which ideas and realities move in opposite directions, in which social turmoil and human suffering conflict the old allegiances, in which people find it literally impossible to continue to live according to the old ways, in which the outbreak of sudden confrontations creates new antagonism and new loyalties. End quote. Chris Harman, The Return of the National Question. The purpose of this work that I'm writing is to debunk all these ideas and notions on national liberation movements not being revolutionary or even straight up reactionary. It's honestly really annoying that this debate has started all the way back from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels making a response against Bruno Boire, Alice Willich, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon all the way back since 1844, and it's still been going on with a bunch of misunderstandings on the issue still. This argument alone has been going on literally 2 centuries and a half long, yet we still can't find an understanding. Here, I want to make the argument in favor of national liberation movements, enshrine in the truth that all of us can find together when working. All of us can find together when working together on this issue and looking at the history, economics, politics, philosophy, culture, and conception of our world today in relation to nationalism of oppressed people. Because if we can't even agree a workers' movement indeed. If we can't even agree that a workers' movement indeed is a workers' movement just because it has nationalistic tendencies, that is actually acting in favor of internationalists and has understood this movement can produce a revolutionary situation to spread classical consciousness from a vanguard party and centralize the proletariat to act in an effective revolution, then the left must revamp itself and actually start questioning itself, or else it will eat itself from this infantile disorder. First, before I actually get into the nitty-gritty of things, I want to acknowledge maybe some of the terminology in this video and my particular term of leftists I mentioned that are against national liberation and forms of nationalism from oppressed people. Vladimir Lenin, in his time, when debating this subject, had not really gave a term when he was first originally proving his own contributions on the national question, being debated in the German and Swedish socialist movement. That, of course, his opposition to both positions of Karl Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, and bring back Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' positions when they're first declaring their oppositions to Bruno Boire and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. In their thesis on Jewish people's liberation against capitalism, because both of them were actually very anti-Semitic, but they try to hide it through mystified arguments that Jews were actually reactionary rulers, our world that managed all of capitalism and hunger strings of society. This is referring to Bruno Bois and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. They were actually anti-Semitic. And against their undialectical statements and substitutionist positions on the Krakow Revolution of 1848. However, in 1920, when the Communist International, being made up of communist revolutionaries that agreed with Rosa Luxemburg's vulgar quote-unquote internationalism, and also the spring up of national liberation movements that were establishing worker states and the rise of just workers' revolutions that could spread class and political consciousness with enough effort from a vanguard party to do so, such as the Alsace-Lorraine Soviet Republic, Bavarian Soviet Republic, the Bremen Soviet Republic, Slovak Soviet Republic, Soviet Republic of Saxony, Rand Rebellion, the Patagonia Revolution of 1920 to 22, the Polish Revolution of 1918 to 22, Iraqi Revolution of 1920, the Irish Revolution, Mongolian Revolution, revolts of Arabia, etc. During the revolutions of 1917 and 1923, the national question was brought up. On Vladimir Lenin, seeing the arguments spring up again, got involved in the debates with Dutch, German, and Italian socialists in agreement with Rosa Luxemburg that considered themselves the left wing of the Communist International. After saying their own articles and works that the Bolsheviks started to represent a right-wing faction in the Communist International. However, seeing that he still is managing to win over a large majority of the Communist International among the workers themselves, just by debunking each argument one by one, he decided to make his points clear in the context of the revolutionary situations and revolutions of 1917 to 23. In a book he wrote and published under the Communist International, specifically for both members of the Communist International and workers around the world, trying to encourage them to join the Third International and revolt with their theory a part of that revolt. This would completely win over a large base of workers in the Communist International and allow more progress to help revolutions commence. This book is called Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder by Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, calling the left wing of the Communist International, referring to themselves as the Communist Left or Left Communists in short, entirely as an infantile disorder, he later said in a meeting in the Communist International that it was used to specifically refer to the opposition to electoral participation in the bureaucratic election and opposition to support for national liberation movements, because those were the things that defined left communism as a whole in comparison to other communist and Marxist tendencies at the time, and still continues to do so today. As well with them, the particular form of opposition to anti-fascism that emerged in 1926, which is also defines a difference with other communists today. The reason why is simply to show that these people do not think or look at things dialectically, or even read as much theory as they show themselves to have, as an illusion towards others in the Third International. Of course, however, more splits emerged and even other movements organically formed with their own statements and have a contradiction to the quality to others and makes a difference from them to others. To the point that this kind of tendency emerged outside of left communism. However, the point is that the criticism that Vladimir Lenin made against left communism still applies to the tendencies in opposition to national liberation movements as a whole. That being, they do not think dialectically, and thus have an infantile disorder. Not that they are bad, but that they have a huge problem in their critical thinking process that thus leads them to these conclusions. However, by calling these people as infidels despite explaining the concept of why the term applies, can come off as a bit ableist and say that people with mental disorders are not smart, or don't think people you call infidel for their opinion. I could call them vulgar internationalists, but I don't even want to call them internationalists at all, because they don't see the dialectic between this kind of quote unquote nationalism and it actually produces in its internationalist action. I could just call them liberals because of the fact that globalists, liberals, social democrats, and populists in general always say that they're trying to have a statement that talks to the liberation of specific people, excludes the liberation of others that are also oppressed in different ways, thus meaning that we have to integrate our statements for liberation to apply to everyone, not black rights, women, basically saying not black rights, women's rights, or trans rights, but human rights, which is the kind of ideas and principle philosophy that these kinds of people and principal philosophy of these kinds of people, and it's simplistic, and it disregards and ignores the complexities of the struggle in capitalism. But I do indeed know, and others should too, that people like Rosa Luxemburg, Anton Panana-Cook, Amadia Bordiga, and Donnie Gluckstein are definitely not liberals. And to say otherwise is completely dishonest and used as an insult rather than actually using a well-coherent terms to define a trend. However, one term all these people use or have used to describe this position, and most even embracing it, is the term ultra-left. So from now on, I'm going to refer this position on the national question as the ultra-left take. And people that advocate for this as ultra-leftists, reason why is because I think it is this is probably the least controversial and least inaccurate term to refer to this position that people hold. This does not mean I'm calling Ian Vaush, Demon Mama, and any of their followers as actually being a part of the ultra left. I agree, they are far from it. They are far from the ultra left, and they're more like liberals if anything. As well, I agree with the ultra left that they do not represent the ultra left. But I'm not just talking about the pragmatic left. I'm talking about the entire position of a debate that has been going on for 2.5 centuries. And that should have ended in 1864 with the establishment of the International Working Men's Association, or at least in 1920 during the Second Public World Congress of the Communist International. And since, as well, historically the ultra left is really the most influential group that breeds this thinking, I am going to refer to anyone that holds this position in this work as ultra left and explain the problems of the ultra left. I also want to make this clear now that when this work is published, I am not interested in debating Vaush or anyone at all that proclaims themselves as a pragmatic leftist. Pragmatism as a philosophy focuses so much on the practice itself over the actual ends of things that this practice is trying to act on. That it completely abstracts the practice and the end to the ends of the practice, to the point where it defeats the purpose of the practice and methods. As well, Ian Vaush trying to justify this as a synthesis between consequentialism and pragmatism is completely ignorant to the philosophy of consequentialism, as all negative consequentialism does. The point of consequentialism is not to just think that since actions have consequences, we should focus on the negative sides of consequences and avoid them as much as possible. Is to think that since our actions have consequences, we need to be able to take a deep analysis and understanding on our thinking in consequentialists, so that way we can produce consequences that can fill ends, and those ends justify the means as long as the means are correlated with the ends. Therefore, the motive itself matters, and the motive needs a principle behind it. I am okay debating left communists of any kind on this subject, and even other subjects as well. if they want to. However, the kind of debate bro culture Ian Vaush and Vaushists is malicious and mostly trying to embarrass or win an argument rather than having a well-rounded debate. As well, debates in general can only work so far with the kind of people you debate, as Vladimir Lenin talked about. Therefore, I am not interested in debating Vaush, Demon Mama, or anyone that proclaims himself as a pragmatic leftist. As a final acknowledgement, I also want to thank comrades of mine and members of my Discord server for inspiring me to make this video directly and indirectly. So thank you, Electro. Thank you, Disculane Eric. Thank you, Bolshagirl / Feminine Bolshevik. Thank you, Zoomer Communist. Thank you, Vox Populi Spartacus. Thank you, Gen Z Bolshevik. Thank you, Syrian Communist. Thank you, Revolutionary Socialist on Instagram. Thank you, Richard Donnelly. Thank you, Sophia Beach. Thank you to Elizabeth Adolfo. Thank you, Nellie Wong. Thank you, Claire Lemich. And thank you others that rather keep anonymous, a part of the International Socialist Tendency and Committee of the Revolutionary International Groupment. Everyone I mentioned and others that I didn't as well inspired me to make this work. These are all of my acknowledgments I wanted to address, and that's about it. Okay, guys, so this is the introduction to basically my videos and stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed. The more content of basically what's more to come is going to come out, so be in tune for that. Anyways, thank you guys for watching this video, and if you liked the video, then hit the like button down below. I very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I would also very much appreciate that. And if you're new, and stay organized and stay safe, but remain dangerous. Anyways, see you guys. Socialist Lynx is out.